Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode of IVSA Kelantan podcast show. The topic for today is Prospect of Veterinary Field and Veterinarians in the Future by our guest speaker Professor Azam Khan. A little bit about the speaker's background. Professor Azam graduated from the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, University Putra Malaysia in 1988. Then, he worked as a veterinarian and livestock development executive with Kumpulan Guthrie Berhad, where he was responsible for the health, management and livestock development of 20,000 breeding and trading sheep. 4 years later, he left Guthrie to pursue his PhD in Glasgow, Scotland. Upon returning from Glasgow, he worked at UPM and Cyberjaya University College of Medical Sciences before leaving to work with small ruminants, specifically boyer goats.
Prof. Azam then came to Kelantan to help in setting up Malaysia's second veterinary school. He served as the Dean for the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, University Malaysia Kelantan from 2011 to 2015, then again from 2017 to 2021. He is joining us today on our podcast to talk about the prospect of the veterinary field and veterinarians in the future. First of all, in order to talk about the future of the veterinary field, I think it's important for us to understand the differences in this field right now compared to how it was in the past. Could you tell us how being a vet student now compares to being a vet student during your time? Are there any marked differences?
Certainly. And the big difference is basically in access to veterinary texts, in the way knowledge is being imparted, because in those days, particularly veterinary information is achieved through textbooks. So students will usually acquire their own textbooks. You do not find the desired numbers in the library and so on. So a lot of us have our own anatomy books, physiology books. We have our own histology books, and when we move into clinical years, we have our own clinical texts and so on. And we use those books to prepare for, apart from what we can get from the library, to prepare for our work and assignments. Work and assignments are the same. There's always work, regardless of whether we work during my time or your time now. There's always work. Vet students are expected to spend a lot of time studying. That has been the character of vet students around the world as well. And of course the other one is access. Now you have internet, and in a short while you can get access to a lot of information. We don't have that in those days. And how students are being taught today, a lot of us are, if you enter classes and so on, slides and videos and role play, and the methods of teaching have changed tremendously. We used to have this didactic teacher student, from teacher to student, and very seldom we were engaged. As we progress in the forms of enrichment in education, that we started to see all this problem-based learning and so on coming in. So that's a huge difference. That's a difference. Gender in the veterinary profession. During my time, there were more boys in the class as compared to now, where you have 70% of them girls. Expectation of what comes after. Huge difference, because where we move on into the profession after that. So those are the major differences that I can tell of for now .
Moving on from that point, what do you think are the challenges that vet students need to look out for as they venture into this field?
What are the challenges they need to meet? We are responsible for animal health. We are responsible for public health. We are responsible for our environment. It's not a course that you can take lightly. It's not a program that you can take lightly. We are responsible for lives, despite the fact that it's a creature's life. But a lot of those diseases that impacted humans are basically coming from that population of animals, be it domestic or wildlife. That's in our environment. Jadi we have a big role to play. When you become a vet student, you are expected to have some command, desirable command of apa dia kata, the different species, and then and now it's the same. We're talking about companion animals, basically cats and dogs. We're talking about horses, you are exposed to that. You're talking about ruminants, cows, goats and buffaloes. These are domestic livestock. Poultry, particularly chicken and ducks, and some exotic species, especially which is related to zoo medicine. There's a huge difference if you're looking at anatomy, you're looking at behavior, you're looking at response to even if you're talking about one day you'll discover when you do pharmacology, the response to drugs are different because of the species and so on. You have to have a desirable level of knowledge with regards to anatomy, physiology of this particular species that we've talked about. So it's a lot. It's a lot to remember. But why is it that we emphasize that you got to read a lot also? Because one of the other things, you cannot remember everything in your head. So you must be able to search for information. So trying to get information, or how you find this information, and not just any authentic information with regards to what you're looking for, is an art. Jadi you are being trained to look for this information even in your veterinary program. That's why we have a lot of assignments, problem-based and so on, for you to find information. Why? Because there's no way that you can have everything in your head. I had a teacher who once told me, the phrase was a place for everything and everything in one place. So there are things that you put in your head, and there are things that you know where to go for. So there's a lot of information that must be in your head, but there are equally important information that you don't keep in your head, tapi you must make sure that you know how to look it up in books ataupun other sources lah where this information are stored today lah, the data repository lah. I hope I've answered that question.
So, Professor had already spoken about how to look for information and all of that stuff, like through Google or through books. Then how do you know that if it's authentic or not, since there's a lot of fake informations right now?
Go back to books, and that's how you do it. Go back to journal papers. There are a lot of journals and books that are written by people in the field. Jadi sometimes you got to counter check. You cannot rely completely on Dr. Google or Dr. Wikipedia. What are some of these other things you all look at apart from Wikipedia and Google?
Oh, we have Google Scholar.
Yes.
They compile all the papers and
Google Scholar is fair.
Articles.
Research articles, Google Scholar is acceptable, but sometimes students they suka Wikipedia lah. These are the general ones where there may be information that may not be accurate. Why? Because it's not necessarily peer reviewed.
Yes, that's true.
Jadi you want to go and look at documents that are peer reviewed, and text. There are a lot of authentic, good text, veterinary text around from great publishers and so on that you have to refer to lah. So I think that's the only way to make sure that you do it. You don't plagiarize, you don't copy word for word, but you try to understand and you try to check them. No, you don't have to check every single piece of information. You will know what you need to check and what you need not. Okay. Some things are mentioned in class, so there's no issue. Some things that are not mentioned, you discuss and decide whether it's of value, right or wrong. So this is how you do it. But now you consult, you talk to your teachers, you talk to your friends, you look in books, you look into books. You hope that after 5 years you will graduate. You hope that after 5 years you will graduate and you will become a successful veterinarian. So you are a student and you hope to become a successful veterinarian. There are a lot of things that's going to affect this outcome. Number one is you yourself, your attitude, your aptitude for this field. Some of you are coming in because you have always wanted to be a vet. You have this passion for the medical sciences. Your mind must be such for you to want to come to this, that you are the type of person who long to find answers, inquisitive mind to a lot of scientific and biological sciences, issues related to biological sciences. So we're talking about that, yourself as a person who has got to ensure that you become a successful vet, that you live to the expectation of the profession. Please remember, you are in an environment, you have a teacher, and how you relate to your teacher is important. So most of the time, if you're talking about, so who do you learn things from? So you're lucky because you're in the university, that is basically taken care of. Most of your teachers are qualified, they went through their respective training and so on, and they are the ones that provide you with the teaching and learning experience. Then there are other things in life, your friends, how they influence you. You have some friends who are not as rigid with regards to how they study. Some students come in and they fool around, think it's an easy go breeze with the vet program. That's not the case. Friends come in and friends can influence you. If you stay with friends who are concerned, who wants to study, who wants to find out answers to the things that you do within the program, fine. But if you have friends that are always enjoying, they like to do other things besides studying, that's one thing you got to sacrifice time to enjoy. I don't know if vet students can really enjoy. When I was doing some externship programs, I did spend some time over the years that I've been in the veterinary profession. From time to time, I spend time with veterinarians in other parts of the world. I even have an opportunity to stay within the environment of veterinary students, their colleges or their apartments and so on. Veterinary students are known to work hard. If you go to the UK or the US, the weekdays are spent studying. Vets in the UK and the US and so on, common to see vet students having their own pets. They have their own dogs or cats, mostly dogs. And they will spend their time studying, and apart from that, whatever they do elsewhere is probably to take their dogs out for a walk. They have to do that. But their weekdays are spent studying. And then when weekend comes, they go drunk and they party. So you may think that, oh, they go drunk and we don't go drunk, for example. You may think that way, but no, there is a time to play and there is a time to focus and work hard. So very disciplined. And so I know of vet students who have to do as they come into the clinical years and they're doing thyrogenology. I'm talking about thyrogenology because basically it's the field that I'm also familiar with. They've got to go down into the field as early as 4 in the morning to do the rectal palpation first before the cows come in to be milked and so on. Because once the cows come in to be milked, for example, they are not supposed to meddle because milk has got to go out. So university usually have farms and so on, and they bring these cows in to be milked. But students will practice their rectal before that, as the cows before the morning, and so they go into the meat as early as 3 to 4 in the morning. So when you look at that and look at us, there's a huge difference in how people, what people take into study. Some parts of the world, in the US in particular, you got to at least have a first degree before you can actually pursue a veterinary program. So the element of maturity is also important in some parts of the world. So we are lucky because as a student graduate, you go to matriculation program. If you decide to come into a veterinary program, you may come into a veterinary program, and then that's where you start to learn. So perhaps during that 5-year program, you mature. It's not just the veterinary, it's in the way you think, decision making and so on. Vets are very durable type people. They can go in Malaysia. You can find veterinarians in politics. You can find veterinarians in businesses. You can find veterinarians in institution of higher learning, in a research environment, in the pharmaceutical industry, in the livestock feed industry. You find vets all over. So the most important thing is to be educated and how you use that what you have learned to live a good life. That's more important. Okay. Jadi banyak benda. The environment that you are in, this is going to make a big difference. The planning, did you plan? If you don't plan, if you don't plan, then you plan to fail. How do you plan your studies? How do you plan your 5 years within the vet faculty? Do you think about these 5 years? Do you think about the years ahead of it? What is going to happen after I graduate? Which area would be of interest to me? When you decide to make that interest decision on that would be an area that you will be interested in. How do you pursue so that you become good at what you are doing in terms of continuing education and so on? Where do you want to go for continuing education? That's planning. And then the implementation, you got to act on your plan. If you plan and you don't act, it's not going to work. So if you decide that today I'm going to get a vet degree from University Malaysia Kelantan, but in 5 years time I hope that I would be able to at least pursue continuing education in the UK or in the US and be a board certified veterinarian, for example, so that I get the right competencies and skills, and that I become more marketable apart from just being a graduate from Malaysia. Then you would act on that from as early as now, knowing where to go, what to do and so on. We have a lot of our graduates after during the time when I was lecturing in UPM, a lot of our graduates that come after that time eventually went on to pursue. We now have a lot of Malaysians who are even academia within universities of rank. So we have students abroad who are actually working as lecturers and so on. Our ex-students and so on are working as lecturers. They've gone beyond their teachers and in achieving a certain form of recognition. So you got to decide that whether you want that or not. And then you got to evaluate yourself where you are going, so that you know whether you are achieving what you are doing or not. You have a target, you got to evaluate and see whether you are on course to achieve your target. So these are all the challenges. A student should think about all this, because this is what is going to make them successful. Okay, did you think about this before? Tak ada sangat kan?
Yes, we think, but it's not that deep. Not deep.
Yeah. This map that I show you is like a disease punya ni. It's actually a disease.
The triangle.
This triangle is actually taught to me by my lecturer, Dr. Ungku Chulan in Kumosing. So this is the animal, this is the person who takes care of the animal, and this is the environment. This is the systems, the waste system, feeding system. This is the environment, and whether that's going to be productive or not will depend on all this. This is a disease map that was invented or taught to us by Ungku Chulan in 1980. Between 1983 and 1988, when I was a student, and we use this. I use this for management. I use this for everything in my life. So that can be anything. You can be politician, you can be businessman, you can be manager, you can be anything with this disease. Okay, tanya lagi. Nah, aku tutup ke tak?
So, Professor, you've mentioned a lot of things about how vets are durable people and how they manage to go into many different fields. But I think there's one vital point to remember is how the Malaysian Veterinary Council plays a great role in shaping the future of the veterinary field in Malaysia right now. What changes should we expect, and how should we, as students and future practitioners, adapt to them?
We are the ones who shape the future. We are the ones, the veterinary mess, who is going to decide. The council is basically regulating to make sure that we conform to certain guidelines or code of conduct of the practice, the ethics and the morality that veterinarians hold. Tapi who are the ones that influence this and make this possible? It's us, the bigger mess, the majority. You cannot expect 6 to 10 people sitting on a committee to decide how we act. It is us who's going to decide how we act. Of course, we benchmark ourselves against the rest of the world. I mean, you don't want to be different, and you don't want to be, at the end of the day, doing something that doesn't tango well with the conduct of the profession. So certainly we benchmark ourselves with the rest of the world, and we are the ones who should dictate and charter the path of how veterinarians should behave and do it. It's got nothing to do with the council. Council regulates and make sure that what we charter is right or wrong. Jadi I think maybe your view on the council may be different lah, but that's my view on it. Okay. So we wouldn't expect any. You're asking me what expectations, what changes to expect. At the end of the day, a veterinarian must be knowledgeable. If you go and look at day one competencies, what is expected of veterinarian? They must be knowledgeable. Now, who is going to monitor whether you continue to acquire knowledge or not? That's where the council says that for you to ensure you continue to have your license to practice, we expect you to follow a certain number, to acquire a certain number of continuing education points on an annual basis. That is forcing us to make sure that we continue to study, and most of the time the education points that you get, speedy points that you get, is related to the area of specialization, what you are interested. If you are a small animal vet, a companion animal vet, you probably would do a lot of CPD regards to companion animal medicine. Could be surgery, could be medicine, almost anything related to that species. So I think that is how they regulate, to ensure that vets must be knowledgeable, and you expect them to continue to, on an annual basis, to learn something. And we expect that these CPD points that we acquire for our annual practice is sufficient to say that yes, there is an effort on the part of the veterinarian who is providing the service to ensure that he acquires the desired level of knowledge, so that his practice fulfills the needs of society. Veterinarians should be passionate, compassionate. Dia ada dua. A better word for it perhaps is probably altruistic. Jadi it's a criteria, value that is expected of veterinarians. Now this value that is expected of you must be cultured to a certain extent, because you may love animals, but you got to go beyond love. To be altruistic, to be compassionate, knowing when to extend a life, knowing when that taking away a life is probably the best choice for your patient, your client. Mind you, when we talk about patient and clients, we have two. We have the animal and the owner. The owner is also affected, emotional, so we have to have the emotional intelligence. Now that may or may not be taught directly in the 5 years that you are here, but you are expected to acquire them over your years in practice as a veterinarian. Jadi there are powerful words that you can associate with veterinarians: knowledgeable, altruistic, passion, compassionate. You're talking about skill. You're not just talking about knowledge, you're talking about skills, because the species that we are talking, 7 different species we are talking about, different behavior. Jadi you got to understand behavior. You got to we see problems from a different perspective. Huge difference between us and the medical human doctors. In the case of a human doctor, you have pain, you walk into the knee, you are able to describe your pain. But you deal with an animal. A horse that has colic is not going to walk into and say, "Doctor, I have a stomach pain." You got to be able to identify it. Sometimes the animal is so quiet sitting, it's suffering. So you got to be able to evaluate whether there is pain, there is suffering, because one of your roles is to alleviate this. That's the right word, kan? Alleviate.
Yes.
So to alleviate the pain. Animals, different species, animals having a toothache, they can't come and tell you, "I'm having a toothache," but they will have a toothache, and you have to be able to identify that toothache. They have colic problems, they have toothache problems, they have problems with digestion, they can't digest, they have diarrhea. There's a reason. Some signs are so clear you can see, some signs are so obscure that you may have to see beyond what is seen with the eyes. You got to use your senses, your hearing, your smell, the smell. Sometimes you are in an environment and you are not able to see anything, but you would be able to smell, for example, maggot. That's very popular among vets, maggot wounds and so on. So you start looking for wounds to be able to identify problems that are associated with disease in animals. How to prevent them from in some infectious disease from moving from one animal to the next. Maknanya you are not just talking about treating, you're talking about controlling, managing it, and preventing an outbreak. You're talking about biosecurity. You're talking about food safety. Jadi huge areas, and therefore we should look at ourselves as very important people. Not just in Kelantan dia kata apa, Dr. Nate, not just an animal doctor, because our work goes beyond the boundaries of just animals, because every animal will come into contact with another human being. Jadi to be able to recognize problems, recognize diseases, very important. That's why you got to work hard. Apa lagi?
Finally, before we wrap up this session, may I ask, what would be your number one advice for students wishing to pursue this field?
Oh, my number one advice for students wishing to pursue this field. I don't know. Most of the time, I tell my students, you got no choice but to work hard. The number one risk is, then I think my advice is make the right choices. That will be my number one advice. Make the right choices. Why? Because those choices you make will impact you and impact the people around you. So it's a ripple effect. So if you make the wrong choices, it's a ripple effect from you to the people around you.
To conclude, the field of veterinarians is growing scientifically and technologically as they become more in demand. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Prof, for coming to speak for this topic, and also to all the viewers, thank you for listening to our podcast.